Okay, let's unpack this. The global economic war against Russia, well, it just hit a really dramatic new phase, a phase defined by coordinated aggression, you could say. For almost 3 years now, the West has been really trying to cripple Moscow's military machine, but, the
Yeah.
Russian economy. It proved surprisingly stubborn, resilient. It adapted, it pivoted eastward. Now, though, now the gloves are truly off.
Yeah, absolutely. What we're seeing here is a strategic, a really profound recalibration. It's a deliberate shift,
Yeah.
moving decisively away from just targeted pressure, which, let's face it, proved insufficient. Now it's heading towards full-scale, direct economic warfare. The aim: crush Russia's core energy revenue stream. Simple as that. It's an undeniable escalation. October 2025, that's a turning point in this whole conflict. Yeah.
So our mission today is to dive deep into this massive coordinated wave of sanctions, the one unleashed by the US and the European Union just recently. And look, this isn't just another round of, bureaucratic paperwork, not at all. This is a strategic hammer blow designed specifically to starve the Kremlin of that hard currency it needs. We've got sources covering basically three fundamental pillars of this moment. First, the specific, really sweeping details of the U.S. blocking sanctions, the ones targeting Russia's two energy giants, Rosneft and Lukoil. Second, the EU side, their comprehensive and, frankly, aggressive 19th sanctions package. That's the one that finally tackles Russian LNG, liquefied natural gas, and that infamous shadow fleet. And third, we need to zoom out, move beyond just the conflict itself. We need to analyze that crucial geopolitical risk. Do these unprecedented measures actually risk fragmenting the entire global economic order? It's what we're calling the de-dollarization dilemma. And maybe most critically, is there still a viable diplomatic off-ramp? Does one even exist anymore?
And that leads to the big question for you, the listener, right? You need to understand the consequences. What happens when the West decides to deploy its ultimate economic weapons? We're talking full-scale oil sanctions, complete financial isolation. How does this whole strategy shift the battle for peace? Moving it away from the trenches, away from the front lines, and squarely onto the world's pipelines, the payment systems, the commodity trading floors. It's a different kind of battlefield now.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is that these moves, they reflect a definitive change in strategy, especially for the Trump administration and its second term. Remember the earlier approach, more transactional, maybe pragmatic. Now it's shifted to calculated, immediate economic coercion, a real change of tack. And at the same time, this cements a complete economic transformation for Europe. Europe is finally, truly, comprehensively cutting the cord on Russian energy supplies. After years and years of just incremental steps, it's a big moment for them, too.
Okay, so let's dive into the first big piece, the headline event, October 22nd, 2025. That's the date. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, as we know it, dropped what some analysts immediately called the nuclear option for energy sanctions. And, as you mentioned, this was President Trump's first major Ukraine-related action of his second term. A big statement. Sweeping, blocking sanctions against two absolute pillars of the Russian state economy, Rosneft Oil Company and Lukoil OAO. These were designated under Executive Order 14024. That's the legal framework.
Right. And this action, it wasn't symbolic, was it? Not just for show. It's purely strategic, designed to immediately choke off that hard currency, the money Moscow needs for its massive military spending. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he was pretty unequivocal about it. He stated the goal was, and I quote, to force Moscow back to the negotiating table by basically depriving it of revenue. It signals Washington's definitive shift towards maximal economic coercion. It's like they're acknowledging that the previous measures, well, they just lacked the bite needed to really change Putin's military calculus.
Exactly. And let's break down these powerhouses under fire, because understanding their size, their sheer scale, is absolutely key to grasping the level of pressure being applied here. First, Rosneft. Okay, this is the state energy behemoth, Russia's largest state-controlled conglomerate. It accounts for nearly half of Russia's total oil output. Just think about that, half. That number translates to around 6% of global crude production, so it's a major player on the world stage. And its CEO, Igor Sechin, notoriously powerful figure, very close confidant of Vladimir Putin. So what does that mean? It means every single dollar of Rosneft's massive revenue stream is basically a cornerstone of the Russian federal budget. And it directly supports their military-industrial complex. There's a straight line there.
Okay, so Rosneft is the state giant. Then there's Lukoil OAO. Now, you mentioned Rosneft is state-controlled. Lukoil technically is privately owned, right? But it's still a critical, massive global player, absolutely essential to Russia's export network, its infrastructure. So the decision to target both of them, Rosneft and Lukoil simultaneously, that really multiplies the pain, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a one-two punch. Together, just these two companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, they ship over 3.1 million barrels per day.
3.1 million barrels a day.
Per day. That's roughly half of Russia's total food exports. Half. The clear goal here is to restrict this entire volume, this huge flow of oil, from accessing the global dollar system. Cut it off financially.
And OFAC wasn't messing around with loopholes, it seems. They made sure this was comprehensive, right, to stop corporate evasion tactics.
This wasn't just slapping the parent company names on a list. That wouldn't work. The really crucial part of the sanctions toolkit here is something called the OFAC 50% rule. Have you heard of that?
Explain that a bit more, the 50% rule.
Sure. So the sanctions automatically extended to dozens and dozens of subsidiaries.
Yeah.
The rule explicitly states any entity that is owned 50% or more, either directly or indirectly, by Rosneft or Lukoil, is automatically blocked. Same sanctions apply, instantly. This is designed specifically to minimize corporate layering, setting up shell companies to try and get around the sanctions. It cuts through all that immediately.
Okay, so they went deep. Let's talk about the scale of that targeting. What kind of subsidiaries are we talking about? Upstream? Downstream?
Both. They went right for the core operations. For Rosneft, for instance, the U.S. hit crucial production subsidiaries, like Lugansk that's instrumental to their daily output. Massive production there. And Sametlor, that one manages one of the world's largest onshore oil fields, a legendary field, actually. But they didn't stop at production. They also targeted critical refining and export hubs. Think places like the Ryazan oil refinery and the Arnin-Tuapse refinery down in the Black Sea. Key export points. They're trying to freeze the oil at every single stage, from pulling it out of the ground to refining it to loading it onto tankers for export, hit the whole chain.
And a similar approach for Lukoil, I assume, hitting them across their structure, too.
Exactly the same playbook. Lukoil was targeted across its complex, vertically integrated structure. OFAC sanctioned its exploration and production arms, like Lukoil Perm, vital for finding new reserves. They hit its critical offshore development division, Lukoil Kaliningrad-Morneft, which operates in the Baltic Sea, and key production units like Lukoil West Siberia, another huge production area. The list they published was incredibly detailed, very expensive. It makes it abundantly clear that Washington's intent here is to paralyze pretty much every key node in Russia's energy supply chain that touches the international market.
And the timing was immediate, right? No warning, no wind-down period.
Immediate. Zero grace period. The sanctions took effect right away on October 22, 2025. That forced global counterparties, banks, traders, shippers to scramble instantly. They had to unwind deals, figure out their exposure, basically drop everything. But, the real power, the true leverage of this action, it lies beyond just freezing assets in the U.S. It's the secondary sanctions.
Right, the secondary sanctions. We hear that term a lot. Explain exactly how they work in this context and why they're so powerful.
Okay, so secondary sanctions are basically the mechanism by which the U.S. weaponizes the dollar's dominance in the global financial system. These measures threaten non-U.S. institutions around the world. Think major commercial banks in Hong Kong or Singapore. Think massive commodities traders based in Dubai or Geneva, or state-owned refineries in India or maybe Turkey. OFAC warns them. If you facilitate significant transactions with these newly sanctioned entities, Rosneft or Lukoil, then you risk being cut off from the U.S. financial system yourself, access denied to dollars. So Washington is essentially forcing the world into a choice. Do you want to maintain your access to the U.S. dollar, which is vital for almost all international business, or do you want to keep trading with roughly half of Russia's oil production? You can't easily do both anymore.
Okay, but that sounds like it puts the U.S. in a really tricky diplomatic position, doesn't it? Especially with countries they consider partners, like India, for example. India buys a lot of Russian oil. How do they actually enforce that leverage without completely blowing up strategic relationships?
That is the absolute tightrope walk, isn't it? It's inherent in using secondary sanctions. It creates friction. The sources we looked at suggest the Trump administration is trying to use targeted coercion, maybe more surgical strikes rather than a blanket approach. For instance, they've been careful, it seems, not to apply a blanket ban immediately on all Indian refiners. That would cause chaos. Instead, they're using the threat of potential tariffs on other goods, maybe, or specific limitations on other trade deals with New Delhi, using that as leverage. They're trying to pressure India and others to reduce their reliance on Russian crude incrementally, gradually squeeze it out, rather than demanding an instant complete stop, which honestly would probably cause an unmanageable spike in global oil prices. Nobody wants that, not even Washington.
So they're turning the screw, but carefully. And the market reaction, did it show that fear of disruption?
Oh, immediately. The market reaction confirmed the volatility. Brent crude prices, the global benchmark, they jumped instantly, over 5%. They rose to about $64 per barrel right after the announcement. That illustrates the immediate market fear of supply disruption. If that 3.1 million barrels per day suddenly comes off the market, or even a large chunk of it, the global economy feels that pain quickly.
So the U.S. is applying immense pressure, arguably the most direct pressure yet on the energy sector. But they're aiming to do it, it sounds like, without completely shattering global energy stability or totally alienating key swing nations like India. It's an act of immense economic power, sure, but one that requires really careful, continuous diplomatic calibration. It's a delicate balance.
Extremely delicate, and one that will be tested constantly in the coming months. Enforcement is everything with secondary sanctions.
Okay, so that was the American shockwave, but this wasn't just a U.S. move, was it? Europe acted almost immediately afterwards.
That's right. The U.S. move on oil was very quickly followed by a coordinated effort from Europe, almost in lockstep. The European Union adopted its 19th sanctions package against Russia on October 23, 2025, just one day later. This deepened the economic offensive significantly, and the sources we reviewed indicate this massive package wasn't just a routine update. It was adopted as a direct response to something specific, a surge in renewed, really brutal Russian strikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, particularly targeting the energy grid again heading into winter. So this package proves that transatlantic unity, even with, potentially fluctuating political leadership on both sides of the Atlantic, that unity remains pretty robust when faced with clear military escalation from Moscow.
Coordinated response, okay. And what areas did this 19th EU package target? Was it just energy or broader?
It's much broader. It targeted 4 critical areas, really hitting Russia from multiple angles. Energy, yes, banking and finance, maritime transport, that shadow fleet issue, and the technology supply chain. But the landmark decision, the one grabbing headlines, is something Europe had resisted for a long, long time. An outright ban on Russian LNG imports, liquefied natural gas. Remember, for years, pipeline gas from Russia got choked off step by step. But LNG, shipped by sea, continued to flow into some EU ports. Well, that era is now officially ending.
Wow, okay, a full LNG ban. That is a big step. Why is that so significant now?
It's huge because LNG represented Moscow's last major remaining Western energy revenue source. Billions of euros were still flowing that way. This ban effectively accelerates Europe's pre-existing plan. They already had a strategy adopted around 2024, aiming for energy autonomy from Russia by 2027. This LNG ban basically brings forward that goal of complete severance. It forces the issue much faster. The timeline, however, is structured. It's not an instant cutoff, which would hurt Europe too much. It's designed to allow for market adaptation. Short-term LNG contracts, the spot market stuff, they must be terminated relatively quickly by April 23, 2026, so about 6 months. But crucially, the long-term agreements, these often involve dedicated import terminals, complex infrastructure, commitments made years ago. Those are banned from January 1st, 2027.
Okay, so Europe gives itself a window, over a year for the long-term stuff, time to secure alternative supplies, presumably.
Exactly. Time to ramp up imports from other places. Primarily that means the U.S., which has become a huge LNG exporter, and Qatar, maybe others too. But make no mistake, this is still a major blow to Russia. Worth billions and billions in lost revenue, it forces them into a costly, immediate scramble. They have to redirect these massive LNG shipments, these specialized tankers, towards Asian markets, markets like China or India, which are likely already pretty saturated with discounted Russian oil. So Russia will probably have to offer even deeper discounts on its LNG now, and they might need significant, expensive infrastructural upgrades in their own Arctic and Pacific ports to handle this shift efficiently. It's a logistical nightmare for them.
Okay, so LNG is the big energy piece. What about the other areas? You mentioned the shadow fleet. That's been a problem for a while, hasn't it? Russia using old tankers to bypass sanctions.
A huge problem. And Europe is focusing intensely on stopping these evasion mechanisms, specifically that shadow fleet. Ever since the G7 introduced the oil price cap back in, late 2022, Russia has relied on this growing fleet, hundreds of older tankers, often poorly maintained, raising environmental risks, operating under false flags, registering ships in countries with lax oversight, constantly shifting ownership through complex shell companies, relying on opaque, non-Western insurance, all designed to hide the origin of the cargo and bypass the price cap restrictions. The EU, in this 19th package, is aiming to dismantle this entire shadow logistical apparatus, piece by piece.
How are they doing that? What's the scale of this maritime crackdown?
The scale is significant. In this single package, the EU added 117 more vessels to its blacklist
117 in one go.
in one package. That brings the total number of ships restricted by EU rules, meaning they face bans on port access, insurance services, to an astounding 557.
557 ships. That sounds like a lot.
It is a lot. It represents a really significant portion of the entire global tanker fleet that's old enough and available to potentially engage in this kind of shadowy trade, particularly moving Russian crude.
And what restrictions do these blacklisted ships face exactly?
The restrictions are immediate and comprehensive, at least within EU jurisdiction, which is vast. It includes outright port access bans. These ships cannot enter any EU port for any reason: refueling, repairs, cargo transfer, nothing. It includes outright prohibitions on providing insurance and reinsurance services. This is critical because the global maritime insurance market is overwhelmingly centered in London and continental Europe. Lloyd's of London, the P&I clubs, they're mostly Western. Without credible Western insurance, it's much harder and riskier for these ships to operate globally. Many ports outside the EU might also refuse them entry. And the restrictions also hit crucial maritime service providers. Things like classification societies, which certify a ship's seaworthiness. If EU-based societies withdraw certification, the ship becomes almost uninsurable and unwelcome anywhere. The goal is clear: skyrocket the logistical costs and the operational risks of this shadow fleet. Make moving Russian oil exponentially more difficult and expensive, eroding the profit margin even with discounts.
And are they just targeting the ships themselves, or the companies managing this trade too?
They're going after the architecture behind it as well. The financial side. For example, the package explicitly sanctioned Litasco Middle East DMCC. Remember we mentioned Lukoil earlier. Litasco is Lukoil's main international trading arm. The DMCC part, that's important. It stands for Dubai Multi-Commodity Center.
Ah, Dubai, a major trading hub.
Exactly. The DMCC provides a very favorable, often quite opaque jurisdiction for global commodities trading. It's become a key hub for Russian oil trading since 2022, often operating outside the immediate reach of Western regulators. So, targeting this specific Litasco entity based in Dubai is a direct strike. It's an attempt to dismantle the parallel export ecosystems Russia has built to maintain global trading visibility, even for oil from a technically non-state firm like Lukoil.
Okay, hitting the traders in Dubai, where else did the financial clampdown reach?
It extended well beyond just Dubai. The EU really went after the facilitators. They targeted 8 specific banks and oil traders who were operating out of other key transshipment or financial hubs, places like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, the UAE again, and Hong Kong. These entities were accused specifically of facilitating illicit Russian oil sales and helping circumvent the G7 price cap, often through complex payment chains. Furthermore, 5 major Russian banks were added to the blacklist, including Alfa Bank, which is one of Russia's largest private banks, trying to further isolate the Russian financial sector. And they didn't stop there. They also targeted Russia's domestic financial autonomy, trying to cut off bridges even there. EU entities, banks, companies, individuals are now prohibited from interacting with Russia's own centralized domestic payment systems. That means MIR, which is their national payment card system, kind of like Visa or MasterCard, but domestic. In SBP, their fast payment system, which is like an instant bank transfer system. Cutting off links to those isolates Russia further, even for non-sanctioned trade.
Okay, so they're cutting off the traditional financial routes, hitting the shadow fleet traders, even trying to wall off Russia's domestic payment systems. Where does Russia go then? Does this push them towards alternatives, like crypto?
That's exactly the concern, and the EU addressed it head-on in this package. The crypto measures are actually quite fascinating. The sources we consulted called this one of the world's most assertive moves yet by a major regulator to block the use of digital currencies for sanctions evasion. They see the threat.
So what did they do specifically on the crypto front?
It was very targeted. Brussels banned all dealings, buying, selling, holding, facilitating transactions with a specific state-sponsored A7, A5 stablecoin. Now, stablecoins are cryptocurrencies pegged to a traditional asset like the dollar or euro, meant to be stable in value. The A7, A5 is suspected, strongly suspected, of being a Russian central bank-backed digital asset, designed specifically to facilitate cross-border trade with partners willing to bypass the West, think Iran, North Korea, maybe others, a way to move value outside the traditional dollar-row surveillance network. By banning this specific stablecoin and also hitting a related Russia-linked crypto trading platform, the EU is sending a very clear message. Digital assets offer no reliable sanctuary. We are watching this space and we will act. It's quite an aggressive stance in the crypto regulation world.
Right. So energy, shipping, finance, crypto, what was the fourth area? Technology.
Yes. tightening the technological chokehold, trying to slow down Russia's ability to produce weapons and sustain its military operations. The EU added 45 new entities to its export ban list. These aren't Russian companies. These are companies based in third countries, including China, Hong Kong, India, and Thailand. They are accused of supplying critical dual-use goods to Russia's defense industry.
Dual use, meaning things with both civilian and military applications.
Exactly. The kind of stuff essential for modern warfare, but often sold ostensibly for civilian purposes. We're talking sophisticated machine tools needed for manufacturing weapons parts, advanced microelectronics, the chips that go into guidance systems and drones, specific drone components themselves. By blacklisting these foreign suppliers, the EU is trying to cut off these crucial inputs at the source, making it harder for Russia to build or repair its military hardware.
And was it just high-tech components or broader materials, too?
It expanded significantly beyond just the high-tech stuff this time. That's another key feature of the 19th package. They included a much broader range of industrial materials on the restricted list, things like specific chemicals used in explosives or propellants, certain alloys needed for aerospace or armored vehicles, industrial salts, specific types of rubber used in military equipment, and various metals critical for advanced manufacturing. They also, interestingly, sanctioned Russia's largest gold producer. Gold is a way for Russia to store value and potentially trade outside the dollar system. And they even sanctioned 2 Chinese refineries, accusing them of processing Russian oil in ways that help circumvent sanctions. It shows a real willingness now to hit major players, regardless of their nationality, if the EU believes they're facilitating Russia's war effort or sanctions evasion. This depth of coordination hitting energy, finance, shipping, crypto, and the technology supply chain, including third-country actors, all in one go, it's truly unprecedented in a single sanctions package. It's a massive escalation from Europe.
Okay, we've detailed the sheer power and the incredible scope of these October 2025 sanctions from both the US and the EU. It feels like a turning point. But to really understand why they felt compelled to launch such a drastic, coordinated push now, almost 3 years into the full-scale conflict, we need to zoom out, don't we? We need to look back and assess the first 3 years of this economic war, because the initial predictions were pretty dire for Russia.
They were very dire. Since February 2022, the West collectively has targeted, the number is staggering, over 18,000 Russian entities, individuals, companies, banks, you name it. The early phase, remember, was dramatic, freezing around $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held overseas, a massive, unprecedented move, and kicking major Russian banks off the SWIFT international payment messaging system. That was supposed to be the financial nuclear option back then.
Right. And the intended goals were clear, weren't they? What was the West hoping to achieve with those early heavy sanctions?
The goals were pretty straightforward and quite ambitious. Cripple Russia economically. Western projections from major institutions like the IMF and World Bank expected Russia's GDP to shrink dramatically, maybe 8%, 10%, even 15% in that first year. A deep recession. They expected state revenues, particularly from oil and gas, to collapse, and they hoped that the economic pain would erode elite loyalty to Putin, that the oligarchs, the business leaders, would pressure the Kremlin to change course, maybe even leading to political instability. The core objective was clear: force Moscow back to the negotiating table, or even force a withdrawal from Ukraine through sheer economic strangulation.
But that's not quite how it played out, was it? The reality was different, more complex.
Very different. It became a painful lesson, I think, for Western policymakers in the limits of sanctions, or at least in the resilience of a large state-controlled economy facing them. Yes, the ruble crashed initially, panic set in, and GDP did contract in 2022 by about 2.1%. So a recession, yes, but nowhere near the 10-15% collapse predicted. And then the really surprising part, the economy recovered far faster than anyone anticipated. Russia actually managed positive growth of 3.6% in 2023.
Positive 3.6% after all those sanctions.
A positive 3.6%. And preliminary figures suggested even stronger growth, around 4.1% for 2024. This adaptation, this resilience, completely defying Western expectations of an imminent collapse. That's the core of what we call the sanctions paradox. How do they manage it?
Okay, so how did we manage it? What were the key factors behind that surprising resilience?
There were several key factors working together. The most critical one, according to many analysts in our sources, is something they term military Keynesianism.
Military Keynesianism, like war spending boosting the economy.
Exactly. Instead of letting the economy crater, the Kremlin massively ramped up state spending, specifically on defense. Defense spending absolutely soared. By 2025, estimates put it at around 8% of Russia's GDP. That's an enormous share, higher than even during the Cold War for the Soviet Union in relative terms. This massive, centrally planned state expenditure acted like a powerful, albeit artificial, economic stimulus. It fueled internal demand orders for tanks, artillery shells, drones, uniforms, everything. It mobilized internal production, keeping factories running 247 in some cases, and it absorbed labor from sectors that were hit hard by sanctions, like car manufacturing or consumer goods, which relied on Western imports. In effect, the war machine itself became the new, though likely unsustainable and distorted, engine of Russian economic growth.
Right, but you used the word artificial there and unsustainable. So was this real healthy growth or just a sugar high for military spending while other parts of the economy suffered?
That's precisely the crucial caveat. It was GDP growth, yes, the numbers went up, but it wasn't sustainable, healthy, diversified growth, not at all. It was achieved by diverting vast resources, capital, skilled labor, raw materials, away from long-term productive investments, away from healthcare, education, infrastructure, innovation. The consumer economy certainly stagnated or declined in quality and choice. Access to advanced Western technology was severely restricted, hurting many sectors. So it was growth, but growth skewed heavily towards the military, masking underlying weaknesses and setting up potential long-term problems.
Okay, so military Keynesianism was factor one. What else allowed them to weather the storm? Energy must be key.
Absolutely central. The second major factor was the successful, albeit costly, energy reorientation. When Europe started cutting back on Russian pipeline gas and eventually oil, Russia didn't just stop selling it. That would have been catastrophic for their budget. They simply shifted their exports eastward, aggressively. China and India primarily stepped into the void left by Europe. They became the dominant buyers, now absorbing the vast majority of Russian crude oil exports. And this massive redirection was only possible because of the rapid development and deployment of that shadow fleet we discussed earlier.
Right, the shadow fleet again, it seems absolutely critical to their adaptation strategy. How do they manage the logistics of suddenly needing hundreds of these tankers operating outside normal international rules and finance?
It was a massive, opaque, and undoubtedly expensive undertaking for Russia and its partners. They utilized complex logistical maneuvers. Ship-to-ship transfers out in international waters, often in the mid-Atlantic or off the coast of Greece or Malaysia, to obscure the origin and destination of the cargo. They bought or chartered hundreds of older, often secondhand tankers, typically vessels nearing the end of their service life, registered them under flags of convenience in countries with little oversight, places like Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands, sometimes changing flags frequently. They had to arrange alternative insurance, often from Russian or possibly Chinese providers, which likely offered less comprehensive coverage and wasn't recognized by many major ports or charterers. And crucially, Russia had to shoulder the massive discount required to incentivize buyers like India and China to take on the risk and hassle of dealing with sanctioned Russian oil. We're talking discounts of maybe $20, sometimes even $30 or more per barrel, compared to global benchmarks like Brent crude. That's a huge chunk of lost revenue per barrel. However, the sheer volume of sales, even at a discount, coupled with the fact that global oil prices were actually quite high during parts of 2023 and 2024, well, it meant the Kremlin still generated tens of billions, probably hundreds of billions of dollars in energy revenue, enough to keep the budget afloat, fund the war effort, and insulate the economy from the immediate catastrophic collapse the West had initially predicted or hoped for.
Okay, so military spending and the energy pivot east, using the shadow fleet. Was there a third major factor?
Yes, the third leg of the stool was trade diversification more broadly, beyond just energy. Moscow aggressively sought out and tried to secure new trade partners or deepen ties with existing non-Western ones. Commerce with countries in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa surged, or at least Russia tried to make it surge. The most significant shift was clearly with China. Chinese imports from Russia, mostly energy and raw materials, increased dramatically, up something like 60% between early 2022 and 2025. Trade in the other direction, Chinese goods going to Russia, also increased, filling some gaps left by Western brands. Alongside this, Russia implemented really stringent state capital controls early on to prevent money fleeing the country. And they used strict foreign exchange policies, forcing exporters to convert foreign earnings back into rubles to manage and stabilize the ruble's exchange rate after that initial crash. Preventing a runaway currency collapse was key to maintaining domestic stability.
So a combination of state spending, energy redirection, and seeking new trade partners. But you mentioned earlier things were starting to slow down by mid-2025. The adaptation wasn't perfect.
No, definitely not perfect, and the cracks were starting to show more clearly by mid-2025, which likely explains the timing of the new, harsher sanctions. The latest available data, according to our sources, show that GDP growth had indeed slowed quite significantly, down to around 1.1% year-on-year. That wartime stimulus was perhaps running out of steam, or the underlying inefficiencies were catching up. Fiscal deficits were widening drastically. Government spending was way up, obviously, but revenues were falling, reportedly down by 16.9% in the first half of 2025 compared to the previous year. The discounted oil sales and lower gas exports were hitting the budget hard. And perhaps most critically for the long term, industrial imports, particularly of advanced components and machinery, were clearly declining. This indicates that while Russia adapted surprisingly well initially, especially in redirecting raw commodity exports, the technological chokehold from Western sanctions is finally starting to constrict. It's becoming harder for them to get the high-tech parts needed for everything from advanced weapons manufacturing to keeping civilian industries like aviation running. This growing technological gap, this constraint on their ability to modernize or even maintain their military and industrial base over the long run, likely made the October 2025 move seem necessary from the Western perspective. A moment to press the advantage before Russia could find new technological workarounds.
Okay, so the context is clearer now. The Russian economy adapted, but strains were showing. How did experts react specifically to these new October 2025 sanctions? Was there consensus that these would finally work?
The reaction was immediate, but definitely divided. There wasn't a clear consensus. On one hand, there was praise. Edward Fishman, who was actually involved in designing previous U.S. sanctions policy, called the targeting of Rosneft and Lukoil a major, long overdue step. He argued this was finally hitting Russia where it hurts most, the core energy revenues. Similarly, former U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine, like John Herbst and William Taylor, called it a necessary signal of resolve, a way to show Moscow that Western commitment hadn't faded despite the long conflict.
Okay, so some saw it as a necessary escalation. What about the criticisms?
There was sharp criticism, too, arguing that even these measures were still insufficient or incomplete. Jeremy Painter, identified as a former Treasury investigator focused on illicit finance, warned that the measures wouldn't be truly effective on their own. He argued, quote, "Without hitting the banks facilitating the transactions, Putin won't feel it." As a quote. His point was that you need to sanction not just the energy companies, but the entire financial network enabling their sales, especially those banks in third countries. Other analysts echoed this, stressing that the impact on the actual military balance in Ukraine wouldn't change significantly unless the secondary enforcement mechanisms going after those third country banks and traders were immediate, robust, and sustained over time. Not just threatened, but actually implemented. The unavoidable truth, really confirmed by those resilient Russian growth figures in 2023 and 2024, is that economic pressure certainly creates hardship. It forces costly adaptation, it diverts resources, but it does not, on its own, necessarily deliver a quick geopolitical surrender or collapse, especially in a large, centrally managed state willing to impose sacrifices on its population. It's a slow grind, not a knockout blow.
Okay, this is where our conversation needs to shift focus, I think. We move beyond the immediate conflict in Ukraine, beyond the sanctions themselves, to analyze the potential impact on the entire global financial system. This is the heart of what we call the de-dollarization dilemma. And interestingly, one of the loudest voices expressing concern wasn't some critic of sanctions, but President Trump himself. He voiced this unexpected worry that the very act of weaponizing the U.S. dollar so aggressively might actually accelerate de-dollarization. That process where nations strategically reduce their dependence on the dollar. He reportedly warned that prolonged, heavy use of punitive sanctions makes people look for other options. It suggests that even the architects of these powerful sanctions recognize there's a potential self-inflicted risk here, a long-term cost to using this weapon.
It's a fascinating and, frankly, potentially existential concern for American global power. The dollar's dominance right now is overwhelming. It accounts for roughly 58% of all global foreign exchange reserves held by central banks. It dominates international trade settlement. Most commodities like oil are priced and traded in dollars. This dominance grants the U.S. what the former French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called, decades ago, America's exorbitant privilege.
Exorbitant privilege? What does that mean in practice?
In practice, it means the U.S. can run large trade deficits more easily because the world needs dollars anyway. It means the U.S. government can borrow more cheaply because there's always global demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, seen as the safest asset. And, most importantly for our discussion today, it means the U.S. can effectively enforce its domestic laws and foreign policy goals internationally. How? By controlling access to the dollar clearing system. If you want to do business globally, you generally need access to U.S. banks and the U.S. dollar. Washington can threaten to cut that access off. That's the core of sanctions power. But if nations around the world successfully coordinate and find viable ways to trade and hold reserves outside the dollar system, well, then that exorbitant privilege, that enforcement leverage, it starts to evaporate. It's a fundamental challenge to U.S. global influence.
So this isn't a new concern then. How far back do the roots of this de-dollarization effort go? Did it start with the Ukraine war?
No, not at all. The roots go back further, though the recent events have dramatically accelerated it. We can trace a really concerted effort by Russia, specifically back to the first round of major Western sanctions in 2014, following Moscow's annexation of Crimea. Russia clearly took that as a serious warning shot. They realized their reliance on the dollar and Western financial systems made them vulnerable. So, systematically, quietly, but deliberately, they began cutting their exposure to the U.S. dollar. The share of U.S. dollars in Russia's central bank reserves fell dramatically. From around 40% back in 2014, it plummeted to below 10% by 2025.
Below 10%. What did they replace it with?
Primarily two things: physical gold, held within Russia itself where it couldn't be frozen, and the Chinese yuan. They actively shifted their reserve composition towards assets controlled by perceived non-hostile powers or assets they had held domestically.
Okay, so Russia started reducing dollar exposure after 2014, but you said recent events accelerated things. What was the big catalyst?
The absolute game changer, the real shock to the global system, came in early 2022. That was the decision by the U.S. and its allies to freeze roughly $300 billion worth of the Russian central bank's own foreign currency reserves held in Western institutions.
Freezing a sovereign nation's reserves.
Exactly. It was an unprecedented move against a major economy. Whatever the justification in the context of the invasion, that action sent a chilling message globally. It confirmed for every government around the world, especially those potentially at odds with U.S. foreign policy like Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, but even for neutral countries, that holding assets denominated in U.S. dollars or euros, even sovereign state assets, meant those assets could potentially be seized or rendered inaccessible based purely on a political decision made in Washington or Brussels. Your reserves weren't truly yours if they were held within the Western financial system. That was the stark realization.
And that realization must have spurred efforts to build alternatives.
It absolutely catalyzed the creation and expansion of parallel systems. It gave urgency to plans that might have been slow-moving before. Russia responded almost immediately by demanding payments for its oil and gas exports in rubles from so-called unfriendly countries, or increasingly settling trade in yuan or other non-Western currencies, explicitly trying to circumvent SWIFT and the dollar system. And the results were significant. By 2025, according to some estimates cited in our sources, over 90% of bilateral trade between Russia and China was being settled outside the U.S. dollar, using their own systems.
Okay, we need to unpack those alternative systems. You mentioned bypassing SWIFT. What are the actual mechanisms they're using? How do they practically replace the dollar for settling, say, a big oil deal between Russia and China?
They're primarily utilizing two major state-backed payment communication architectures. Think of them as alternatives to SWIFT for sending payment instructions between banks. First, Russia developed its own SFS system for transfer of financial messages. It was created after the 2014 sanctions as a domestic fallback, but they've been actively promoting it for international use, particularly with members of the Eurasian Economic Union and other friendly states. It functions like SWIFT, but is controlled by the Russian central bank, making it sanctions resistant from their perspective. Second, and much more significantly on a global scale, is China's CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System.
CIPS, we hear about that one more often. How does it work?
CIPS is designed specifically to settle international payments in Chinese yuan, CNY. While it's still much smaller than SWIFT in terms of overall transaction volume globally, it's growing very rapidly. The key difference is that CIPS allows for yuan-denominated payments to be cleared and settled directly between participating banks, potentially without needing to go through U.S. correspondent banks, which are the choke points for U.S. sanctions enforcement. So when a large Chinese state-owned refiner buys a cargo of Russian crude oil, they can agree to pay in yuan. The payment instruction goes via CIPS. The funds move between their respective banks, perhaps a Chinese bank and the Chinese branch of a Russian bank, or through banks in friendly third countries also connected to CIPS. And the entire transaction happens completely outside the visibility and control of the U.S. Treasury and the dollar financial system.
This brings us right back to the critical variable in this current intensified sanctions push, China and India. As you noted, they are now buying the lion's share, maybe 70% or more, of all Russian crude oil exports. They are the essential economic lifeline for Russia's energy sector now that Europe is largely out. And crucially, they are settling a large portion of these payments in non-dollar currencies, yuan, rupees, maybe UAE dirham, sometimes complex barter arrangements. The financial separation from the West is already substantial for this key trade flow.
And this is the absolute core of the dilemma for the Trump administration, or indeed any U.S. administration trying to enforce these sanctions. The threat of U.S. secondary sanctions targeting Chinese banks or Indian refiners is powerful, yes. Nobody wants to lose access to the dollar system, but actually using that threat aggressively risks alienating these massive, globally important economies. Beijing, for instance, views U.S. secondary sanctions as an unacceptable form of economic overreach, a violation of its sovereignty, interfering in its legitimate trade decisions with another country. They push back hard against it, rhetorically and practically. New Delhi, meanwhile, prizes its tradition of strategic autonomy. It strongly resists being told by Washington or anyone else who it can or cannot buy essential commodities like oil from, especially if it's getting a discount. So if the U.S. actually pulls the trigger and imposes major sanctions on, say, several large Indian refiners or major state-owned Chinese banks involved in this trade, it doesn't necessarily stop the trade entirely. What it does do is it forces those nations, China and India, to double down, to accelerate their search for more robust non-dollar payment channels, to actively promote the international use of the yuan or the rupee for trade settlement, maybe even for reserves. It basically proves Russia's point that reliance on the dollar is risky and pushes these huge economies further away from the U.S.-led system. It directly accelerates the very de-dollarization process the U.S. is worried about.
So paradoxically, instead of fracturing that emerging Sino-Indian-Russian economic relationship, the intense U.S. coercion might actually risk cementing it, pushing them closer together into a rival economic bloc out of necessity.
Precisely. That's the risk. We are seeing concrete signs of a counter-coalition solidifying. Look at the expanded BRICS Plus alliance. It started as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but it recently expanded significantly, adding key energy players from the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE plus Egypt, and Ethiopia.
That's a very different looking group now, much more energy focused.
Exactly. And these nations, within the BRICS Plus framework, are actively reviving and discussing plans for creating shared financial infrastructure. Things like a common payment system, an alternative to SWIFT for the whole bloc. Maybe even exploring the idea of a new reserve asset, perhaps a digital currency basket, potentially backed by commodities like gold or oil, not just fiat currencies. Now, these are complex, long-term projects. They face huge challenges. But the political will seems to be growing, fueled by the perception of Western sanctions overreach. This isn't just theoretical talk anymore. It represents a direct, multilateral challenge being mounted to the existing USD-centric Western economic structure.
And beyond the pure economics and finance, what's the non-economic driver here? You mentioned sovereignty. How does that play into it?
It's absolutely fundamental. For many nations, particularly in the global south, this isn't just about finding more efficient payment channels. U.S. unilateral secondary sanctions are often viewed, rightly or wrongly, not as legitimate tools of international law enforcement, but as instruments of economic coercion. Using economic muscle to achieve political goals they may not agree with, Moscow very skillfully frames its push for de-dollarization not as aggression, but as a defensive act of sovereignty, protecting its economy and implicitly offering protection to others from politically motivated asset seizures or trade blockades imposed by Washington. This narrative resonates with countries that have historical grievances about colonialism or Western interventionism. It fuels resentment, particularly when you consider the optics, a decision made potentially by a U.S. administration or even just the U.S. Senate, representing a tiny fraction of the world's population. The source material mentioned a figure like a Senate majority representing only 1.9% of the global population can dictate global trade policy. And that policy can have massive planet-wide consequences affecting food prices, energy security, and economic stability in developing nations that rely heavily on stable global commodity markets and predictable financial flows. That perceived asymmetry of power, that sense of being subject to decisions made far away without consultation, is a powerful motivator fueling the push for alternatives, the desire for a more multipolar financial world.
Wow. So the ultimate paradox here, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that the aggressive use of the dollar, America's greatest financial weapon, its exorbitant privilege, is proving to be perhaps the primary incentive for the world's other major economies to collectively accelerate the creation of rival financial systems designed to circumvent it.
That's exactly the dilemma. The more you use the weapon, the more incentive you give your potential adversaries and even neutral parties to develop shields against it. It's a profound strategic challenge for the U.S. in the decades ahead.
Okay, we've explored the sanctions, the Russian adaptation, and the huge systemic risk of de-dollarization. Now, if we connect this all back to the immediate conflict in Ukraine, the source material we reviewed seems to argue quite strongly that sanctions alone, no matter how powerful or biting, probably won't deliver a lasting peace on their own.
That's a critical point that comes through the analysis. Sanctions create necessary pressure. They raise the cost of aggression for Russia. They might degrade military capability over time. They are an essential tool in the toolkit. But the argument is that they are insufficient by themselves to secure a durable political settlement. Only political and diplomatic engagement, however difficult, can provide a sustainable solution. A solution that prevents the world from completely fracturing into these permanently hostile, rearming economic blocks we've been discussing. We need an off-ramp from pure coercion.
And the sources pointed to a recent example, didn't they? The Gaza peace deal. How is that relevant here?
Yes. The analysis uses the recent Gaza peace deal brokered primarily by Qatar and Egypt as a vital conceptual model, even though the conflicts are very different in nature. The key takeaway from that process, according to the sources, is that achieving even a fragile ceasefire, let alone durable peace, often requires the involvement of neutral or semi-aligned states. States that are trusted, or at least seen as relatively impartial, by both sides in the conflict. These mediators can use trust-building, shuttle diplomacy, and finding common ground in ways that the primary belligerents, or powers seen as backing one side, like the U.S. backing Ukraine, simply cannot. The Gaza example suggests a need to move beyond the binary logic of us versus them, of pure coercion and confrontation, and pivot towards genuine political imagination facilitated by credible intermediaries.
Okay, so if that's the model, who could possibly play that role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? It seems like most major powers are already deeply invested on one side or the other.
That's the challenge. But the analysis specifically identifies India and China as the most plausible, though admittedly very difficult and perhaps reluctant, potential mediators.
India and China. Why them?
Well, think about their positioning. Their strategic relationships with Russia are strong, particularly China's. Russia relies on them economically now. That gives them leverage, or at least access, in Moscow that Western countries lack. At the same time, both India and China have massive economic ties and significant market value for Western nations, the U.S. and the EU. They don't want a complete breakdown of the global trading system either. They have an interest in stability. This unique positioning connected to both sides, though asymmetrically, gives them potential diplomatic gravity if they choose to use it. The suggestion from the sources is that Western policymakers need to fundamentally shift their rhetoric, move away from constantly demanding that India and China choose sides against Russia. Instead, the approach should be to actively invite them, perhaps framing it as help us find a middle ground, formally inviting India and China to maybe co-chair peace dialogues, perhaps under a broader umbrella like the UN, or maybe the G20, which includes all these key players, to lend the process essential global legitimacy and buy-in beyond just the West.
Okay, inviting India and China to mediate, that's a big shift. But what would a potential peace process actually look like? Sanctions created pressure, but what's the pathway out? Does a credible solution require some kind of roadmap?
Absolutely. A vague call for talks isn't enough. The analysis argues strongly that a credible solution requires a clearly articulated, sequenced approach. It needs to intertwine multiple elements simultaneously. A ceasefire on the ground, security guarantees for both sides, massive economic recovery and reconstruction efforts, and addressing the deep underlying political issues, including the status of contested territories. The sources lay out a potential structured diplomatic roadmap. The key principle underpinning it is conditional, mutual accountability. Steps need to be verifiable, and progress on one track, like sanctions relief, should be tied to verified progress on another, like troop withdrawal.
Okay, let's break down that sequence. What's step one?
Step one, always, has to be stopping the active killing and destruction, an immediate ceasefire and humanitarian pause. Both sides halt all offensive military operations for a fixed, internationally monitored, and verifiable period. Maybe 90 days initially, potentially renewable. This immediate cessation isn't peace, but it creates the essential space. Space for urgent prisoner exchanges, which builds some minimal trust. Space for verifiable delivery of humanitarian aid to devastated areas. And space for the initial repair of critical civilian infrastructure power, water, hospitals especially crucial after recent escalations.
Okay, a 90-day pause. What happens next if that holds?
If the ceasefire holds, the second phase involves physically separating the armies to reduce the risk of accidental re-escalation. That means forced withdrawal and peacekeeping deployment. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces would need to pull back a significant distance from the current lines of contact. The suggestion was perhaps 50 miles, creating a substantial demilitarized buffer zone. Now, crucially, this newly empty buffer zone cannot remain a vacuum. It needs to be secured. The proposal is for UN peacekeepers to deploy into this zone, but not just any peacekeepers. To ensure credibility and neutrality, these peacekeepers should ideally be drawn exclusively from non-aligned nations. Countries perceived as neutral by both Kyiv and Moscow. Think nations like India, Nepal, Brazil, maybe some African or Southeast Asian countries. Their role would be to monitor the ceasefire, verify the troop withdrawals, and provide a credible, neutral security umbrella to prevent immediate, renewed hostilities while political talks proceed.
All right, ceasefire, pullback, neutral peacekeepers in a buffer zone. What's phase 3?
Phase 3 starts to address the immense human and physical damage of the war. Refugee repatriation and reconstruction. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced, internally and externally. A framework needs to be established for their safe and voluntary return where possible. And critically, the physical rebuilding needs to begin. The proposal calls for the creation of a massive global reconstruction fund. This fund would need to be financed jointly, not just by the West, US, EU, but also drawing in contributions from influential Gulf nations who have financial muscle and ties to Russia, and significantly from China as well. Getting China invested in the reconstruction gives them a stake in the peace. The immediate priority for this fund would be rebuilding essential infrastructure: homes, hospitals, schools, power grids. Providing tangible, immediate peace dividends to the war-weary population on the ground is vital for building support for the process.
Makes sense. Rebuilding lives and infrastructure. What about the political dimension within Ukraine itself? The war has obviously had a huge impact there, too.
Exactly. Step 4 addresses the need for internal political stabilization within Ukraine. For any long-term peace to hold, the Ukrainian government needs a solid foundation and a mandate. This phase involves political reforms and a frigate mandate. President Zelensky, whose term has been extended under martial law, would likely need to seek renewed democratic legitimacy through internationally monitored presidential and parliamentary elections once conditions allow. Following elections, the proposal suggests a carefully prepared national referendum within Ukraine. This referendum would need to address the most politically sensitive, divisive issues head-on. Things like Ukraine's future NATO membership status, maybe neutrality, maybe some other security guarantee, constitutional limits on regional autonomy, particularly for eastern and southern regions, and sensitive issues like language rights. The idea is to ensure that Ukraine's future strategic orientation and internal structure are clearly endorsed through a democratic process by its own people, making the eventual settlement more resilient.
Okay. Elections, a referendum on NATO and autonomy. That leads us to the absolute thorniest issue, doesn't it? The status of the territories Russia currently occupies and claims to have annexed. What's step 5?
This is undoubtedly the most contentious and difficult step. Step 5. Referendums in disputed regions. The roadmap proposes that, under strict, independent, and comprehensive UN supervision, ensuring free and fair conditions, which is a huge challenge in itself, the residents of the 4 regions Russia claims to have annexed, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, would be offered a clear choice regarding their future status. The suggested options might be: 1. Remaining within a newly federalized Ukraine, with potentially enhanced autonomy guarantees decided in a national referendum. 2. Pursuing some form of independence. 3. Joining the Russian Federation. Now, this is politically charged, incredibly complex, and potentially explosive. Getting agreement on the questions, the voter rolls, the security, the monitoring, it's immensely difficult. But the rationale is that internationally verified results, however uncomfortable for one side or the other, would establish a clear, democratically expressed baseline for determining the final political status of these contested territories, moving beyond resolution purely by military force.
That step, holding referendums under UN supervision in occupied territory, it raises immediate skepticism, doesn't it? Would Russia really agree to potentially cede control of territories it currently occupies and has poured resources into based on the outcome of a UN-monitored vote? What's their incentive to even allow such a vote, let alone respect the outcome if it goes against them?
That is the absolute crux of the issue. And that's where the final, crucial step of the roadmap comes in: the leverage. The incentive structure. Step 6, phased sanctions relief. The sanctions, all those powerful measures we spent so much time discussing, are the leverage the West holds. The sources argue passionately that sanctions relief must not be granted up front. It must be proportionally eased and tied directly to each verified step Russia takes toward implementing the peace plan. Reciprocity is key. For example, maybe lifting certain export bans on non-military goods after the initial 90-day ceasefire holds and is verified by the UN monitors. Then, perhaps easing some of the financial sanctions, like on secondary banks, Only once UN peacekeepers are fully deployed in the buffer zone, and the verifiable withdrawal of Russian forces from agreed areas is confirmed. And the major energy sanctions, the ones hitting Rosneft and Lukoil, maybe those are only significantly eased after the referendums and disputed regions are held under agreed UN supervision and the results are internationally accepted, leading to a final status agreement. This phase, conditional reciprocity, is absolutely critical. It's designed to align Moscow's powerful economic incentives, its desire to escape the crushing weight of sanctions, and reintegrate into the global economy with compliance with the peace process, step by painful step. The final comprehensive peace agreement, settling all outstanding issues, would then culminate in the potential for full economic normalization with Russia, rewarding verifiable peace, not rewarding aggression.
So, the ultimate choice presented by this roadmap is stark then. Either continue down the current path of escalating sanctions and military conflict, which risks permanently splintering the world into hostile economic blocs, fueling a new arms race, and potentially accelerating de-dollarization, or commit to a complex, difficult, sequenced diplomatic settlement. One that uses sanctions as leverage for verifiable steps, involves neutral mediators, addresses the core political issues, even the painful ones, and ultimately aims to reintegrate Russia back into the global system, but only on the condition of achieving and maintaining a verifiable peace.
That seems to be the fundamental choice the analysis lays out. Neither path is easy, but they lead to vastly different potential futures for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the global order itself. Hashtag outro takes.
So let's try to synthesize all of this. What does it all mean? Where does this leave us? We've seen, clearly, the most aggressive sanctions push yet in this nearly 3-year-long economic war. The U.S. hitting Rosneft and Lukoil, effectively trying to restrict access for half of Russia's oil exports to the dollar system. That's huge. And the EU finally banning Russian LNG imports, while also getting serious about dismantling the shadow fleet and even targeting sophisticated crypto evasion tools. These moves undeniably confirm the West's continued unwavering commitment to using economic coercion as arguably the primary weapon in this conflict now.
Absolutely. But we also saw, threaded throughout our discussion, the inescapable systemic backlash, the unintended consequences. It confirms those earlier concerns, even voiced by President Trump, about accelerating de-dollarization. By applying this kind of maximal pressure, leveraging the dollar's dominance to its fullest extent, the West is actively, if unintentionally, incentivizing major global economic powers, China, India, potentially others in the BRICS Plus bloc, to speed up their efforts to build and use alternative financial systems. Systems designed specifically to operate outside the reach of U.S. sanctions. It risks accelerating the very splintering of global finance into rival, potentially less stable economic blocs.
The October 2025 sanctions, then, they really do mark a definitive turning point. They seem to confirm that in the 21st century, perhaps more than ever before, economic measures are replacing missiles in terms of strategic importance. And tariffs and sanctions are replacing treaties as the primary tools of statecraft and coercion. The battle for peace, for power, for influence. It's now being fought just as intensely through pipelines, through SWIFT and CIPS, through semiconductor export controls, and fundamentally through the underlying stability and trustworthiness of the currency in which the world chooses to trade.
And that leads us to the final, perhaps provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over. The ultimate paradox of this entire era of intensifying economic warfare, as our sources deeply suggest, might just be this. The greatest long-term threat to the U.S. dollar's continued global supremacy might not actually be the external challenges posed directly by China or Russia building alternatives. Instead, the biggest threat might stem from America's own necessary but increasingly high stakes, reliance on perhaps even overconfidence in its immense financial power as a tool of coercion. If economic warfare, if leveraging financial dominance truly has become the new diplomacy, the profound geopolitical question is, will the world's decades-long reliance on the dollar survive the inevitable next round of global financial isolation and coercion? Or will the very act of using the weapon ultimately weaken its power? That's the question to keep thinking about as you process the implications of this deep dive.